The Texas Bloodbath, the veteran who slaughtered 14 men over a stolen flag. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of Highway 90, turning the air into waves of shimmering heat that made the horizon dance and blur. Marcus Riley squinted through his sunglasses as he guided his black Ford F-150 toward the small town of Del Rio, where the Rio Grande carved its ancient path between nations. The truck's air conditioning worked overtime, battling against the 105-degree afternoon that had settled over West Texas like a wool blanket nobody asked for. Marcus was 52 years old, built like a man who'd spent his youth hauling equipment and his middle age refusing to let it go. His weathered face told stories of deployments to places most Americans couldn't find on a map, and his hands bore the scars of 1,000 repairs on vehicles that probably should have been left for dead. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat engineer, came home with a Purple Heart and nightmares that still woke him up most nights, and now he ran a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of Del Rio. It wasn't much, but it was his, and after everything he'd seen overseas, that meant something. The American flag mounted on the pole outside his shop meant even more. It was a proper 48 by 72-inch garrison flag, the kind that snapped and rippled in the wind with authority. Marcus raised it every morning at precisely 0600 and lowered it every evening at sunset, folding it with the same crisp triangular precision he'd learned in basic training 29 years ago. That flag had flown through dust storms and rainstorms, through the celebrations of 4th of July and the solemnity of Memorial Day. It represented something bigger than himself, bigger than his little corner of Texas, and treating it with anything less than absolute respect wasn't something Marcus could tolerate. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from. Now, back to Marcus's story. He'd noticed them for the first time 3 weeks ago, a group of young men who'd started hanging around the abandoned gas station across the street from his shop. They looked to be in their early 20s, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than most of his customers spent on their car repairs, driving vehicles that had no business being in this dusty part of town. Marcus had seen enough trouble in his life to recognize it when it started brewing, and these boys had that look about them. Too much time, too much money, and not enough sense to go with either. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning. Marcus arrived at his shop at 5:30, like he always did, and found his flagpole spray-painted with crude symbols and profanity. His jaw had tightened as he stood there in the pre-dawn darkness, staring at the desecration. He'd spent 2 hours scrubbing that pole clean before opening the shop, his hands raw and his mind churning with anger he'd learned to suppress over years of therapy and medication. "You okay, boss?" Tommy Cervantes had asked when he showed up for his shift at 7. Tommy was Marcus's only employee, a 24-year-old kid from Eagle Pass who was trying to save enough money to go to community college. He was a good worker, reliable and honest, and Marcus had grown fond of him over the past year. "Just some punks with too much time on their hands," Marcus had replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Nothing we can't handle." But it didn't stop there. The following week, someone had thrown eggs at his shop's front windows during the night. The week after that, they'd slashed the tires on his personal truck while he was inside working late. Each incident ratcheted up Marcus's blood pressure a little higher, made his sleep a little more restless, brought those combat-honed instincts a little closer to the surface. Marcus had called the Del Rio Police Department after the tire slashing. Deputy Sheriff Rodriguez had shown up, taken his statement, and promised to increase patrols in the area. Rodriguez was a good cop, former Marine himself, and Marcus could see the sympathy in his eyes when he looked at the slashed tires. But they both knew that unless someone caught these punks in the act, there wasn't much that could be done. "These trust fund kids from the new development north of town," Rodriguez had said, shaking his head. "Their parents bought up all that land by the lake, built those McMansions. Kids got nothing to do but cause trouble. We've had complaints from half a dozen businesses in this area." "Maybe their parents need to teach them some respect," Marcus had replied, his voice tight. "Maybe so," Rodriguez had agreed. "But you know how it is. Money talks, and their daddy's got lawyers on speed dial. Just document everything, Marcus. If we can build a case, we'll nail them." Marcus had nodded, but something cold and familiar had settled in his gut. He'd felt this way before, in the mountains of Afghanistan, when you knew an attack was coming, but couldn't quite pin down when or where. It was a feeling that made your skin crawl and your senses sharpen, that made you check your six every few seconds and sleep with one eye open. The weather had been particularly brutal that week, with temperatures climbing past 110 during the day and barely dropping below 90 at night. The drought had turned the landscape brown and brittle, and brush fires were popping up all over the county. Water restrictions had been implemented, and tensions were running high across the entire region. It was the kind of heat that made people irritable, made small arguments turn into big fights, made bad decisions seem reasonable in the moment. Marcus had been working under the hood of a 1997 Chevy Silverado on that Friday afternoon when he heard the laughter. It was the kind of laughter that set his teeth on edge, loud, mocking, entitled. He'd straightened up, grabbed a rag to wipe the grease from his hands, and walked to the front of his shop just in time to see 4 young men standing by his flagpole. The tallest one, a blonde kid with a perfectly sculpted haircut and a tank top that showed off muscles built in a gym rather than through real work, had his hand on the flag's rope. Marcus felt his heart rate spike immediately, felt that old familiar surge of adrenaline that he'd learned to recognize as a warning sign. His therapist at the VA had told him to breathe through moments like this, to count to 10, to remove himself from the situation if possible. "Hey!" Marcus had called out, his voice carrying the weight of command he'd once used to direct soldiers under fire. "Step away from that flag." The blonde kid had turned, a smirk playing across his face that Marcus wanted to wipe clean. His 3 friends had clustered around him. One Hispanic kid with designer sunglasses, one black kid wearing shoes that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly mortgage, and another white kid with red hair and the kind of sneer that suggested he'd never faced real consequences for anything in his life. "Or what, old man?" the blonde one had said. His name was Chase Henderson, though Marcus wouldn't learn that until later. "This is a public street. We can stand wherever we want." "That flag is private property," Marcus had replied, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest, "and you need to step away from it. Now." Tommy had emerged from the shop behind Marcus, wiping his hands on his coveralls. "Boss, you need me to call the police?" The question had seemed to amuse the 4 young men. The one with the designer sunglasses, later identified as Diego Morales, had laughed outright. "The police? For what? We're just admiring the old man's decorations." Marcus had taken 3 steps forward, stopping about 10 feet from the group. His hands hung loose at his sides, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight. "I'm going to ask you one more time, politely. Step away from my flag and move along." Chase Henderson had exchanged glances with his friends, that smirk growing wider. "You know what? I think I want to see what this flag looks like up close." His hand had moved to the rope, and Marcus felt something snap inside him, like a dry twig under pressure. "Don't." The word came out flat, hard, carrying 29 years of military training and 3 combat deployments worth of authority. But Chase had already started pulling the rope, lowering the flag. Marcus had moved before his conscious mind caught up with his body, closing the distance in 3 long strides. His hand had clamped around Chase's wrist with a grip that made the younger man yelp in surprise and pain. "I said don't touch my flag," Marcus had growled, his face inches from Chase's. He could smell expensive cologne and see the shock in the kid's blue eyes. For a moment the tableau held, Marcus gripping Chase's wrist, the other three young men frozen in surprise, Tommy standing in the shop doorway with his phone in his hand. Then Diego had stepped forward, putting his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Let him go, old man, before you get hurt." Marcus had released Chase's wrist and turned to face Diego in one smooth motion. His eyes were cold, and something in his expression made Diego take an involuntary step backward. "You boys need to leave, now, before this gets out of hand." The red-haired kid, Kyle Patterson, had pulled out his phone. "This is harassment, dude. I'm recording this. My dad's a lawyer." "And that's good," Marcus had replied. "He can see the video of you trespassing on my property and attempting to vandalize my flag." The standoff had lasted another 30 seconds before Chase, rubbing his wrist, had jerked his head toward their vehicles parked across the street. "Come on, this guy's not worth it, but you better watch your back, old man. This isn't over." They'd left in a cloud of dust and loud music, but Marcus had known Chase was right. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, Marcus had stayed late at the shop, going over the books and trying to calm the racing thoughts in his head. Tommy had offered to stay with him, but Marcus had sent him home. Some things a man had to process alone. He'd taken his medication, the SSRI that was supposed to help with the PTSD, the blood pressure pills that kept his heart in check, and tried to follow his therapist's advice about deep breathing and mindfulness. But when he'd finally locked up the shop at 10 p.m. and headed for his truck, he'd found all 4 tires slashed again, and this time they'd left a note on his windshield. "Next time it's your windows, old man. Learn to share." Marcus had stood there in the darkness, the note crumpling in his fist, and felt something shift inside him. It was a feeling he recognized from Afghanistan, from the missions that had earned him his Purple Heart and his nightmares. It was the feeling of a line being crossed, of patience running out, of civilization's thin veneer starting to crack. He'd called Deputy Rodriguez again, but by the time the deputy arrived, Marcus had already made a decision. He just didn't know yet how far he'd take it. The next day was Saturday, and Marcus had opened the shop for a half day like he usually did. The thermometer on the wall read 112 degrees by 11 a.m. Tommy had taken the day off to visit his mother in Eagle Pass, so Marcus was alone when Chase Henderson's silver BMW pulled up across the street just before noon. This time there were more of them, 8 young men piling out of 3 vehicles, their voices loud and aggressive. Marcus recognized Chase and his 3 friends from the day before, but the others were new faces. One of them was carrying a baseball bat, tapping it against his palm in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. Marcus had been replacing brake pads on a Honda Accord. He'd set down his tools carefully, wiped his hands, and walked to the front of the shop. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. This was it, he realized, the moment that would define everything that came after. "You boys lost?" he'd called out, his voice carrying across the street. Chase had stepped forward, flanked by his friends. "We told you yesterday, old man. This isn't over. You put your hands on me. That's assault." "You were vandalizing my property," Marcus had replied evenly. "That's a crime. Where's your proof?" This came from a new kid, bigger than the others, with a neck like a fire hydrant, and the swagger of someone who'd been the toughest guy in every room he'd ever entered. "Seems to me you assaulted my friend here. Seems to me you owe him an apology." Marcus had felt that old combat clarity settling over him, the way time seemed to slow down, and details became hyper-real. He could see the sweat stains on their expensive shirts, could hear the idle of their engines, could smell the dust and heat and coming confrontation. "I don't owe anyone anything. This is my property. You need to leave." The kid with the baseball bat, Marcus would later learn his name was Trevor Walsh, had started walking toward the shop. "Or what? You gonna call the cops again? They didn't do anything last time. They're not gonna do anything this time either. My dad contributes to the sheriff's campaign. You're just some washed-up veteran with a chip on his shoulder." The words had hit Marcus like physical blows. Washed up, just some veteran. All the hours of therapy, all the medication, all the careful work he'd done to keep his demons locked away. It meant nothing in the face of that casual contempt. These kids had no idea what he'd sacrificed, what he'd seen, what he'd done to keep their privileged lives safe and comfortable. "Final warning," Marcus had said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Leave now, or there will be consequences." Trevor had laughed and taken another step forward, raising the baseball bat. "What are you going to do, old—" He never finished the sentence. Marcus had moved with a speed that surprised even himself, covering the 15 feet between them in less than 2 seconds. His hand had shot out and grabbed the bat, twisting it from Trevor's grip with a move he'd learned in close-quarters combat training. Before Trevor could react, Marcus had swept his legs and put him face down in the dirt, one knee on his back and the bat across his shoulders. The sudden violence had stunned the other 7 into momentary silence. Then chaos erupted. 3 of them had rushed Marcus at once. He'd released Trevor and swung the bat in a wide arc that caught the first attacker, Diego Morales, in the ribs with a sickening crack. Diego had gone down hard, gasping for air. The second attacker, Kyle Patterson, had pulled up short, suddenly reconsidering his decision. The third, Chase Henderson himself, had committed to the attack and paid for it when Marcus's boot caught him in the stomach, doubling him over. "Stop! Everyone stop!" "Hold on!" The voice had come from across the street, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen stood on the porch of her small house. She had her phone out, clearly recording. "I'm calling 911. The declaration should have ended things, should have brought everyone back to their senses, but the combination of heat, adrenaline, and wounded pride created a perfect storm of bad decisions. The big kid who'd challenged Marcus first, his name was Brett Collins, had pulled a knife from his pocket. "You're dead, old man. You're fucking dead." Marcus had seen the knife and felt something cold and professional slot into place in his mind. This wasn't road rage anymore. This wasn't a property dispute. This was life or death. The same calculation he'd made 100 times in Afghanistan. The same calculation that had kept him alive when better men had died. He'd dropped the baseball bat and moved inside the shop entrance, Brett following with the knife extended. The other young men had hesitated, uncertainty finally beginning to penetrate their entitled rage. Mrs. Chen was screaming into her phone, giving the 911 operator the address. Inside the shop, Marcus had backed toward his workbench, his hands raised in what looked like a defensive posture. Brett had advanced, the knife gleaming in the fluorescent lights. "Not so tough now, are you?" "Put the knife down," Marcus had said, his voice eerily calm. "You pull a knife, someone's going to get killed. That's not something you can take back. Should have thought of that before you attacked us," Brett had snarled, lunging forward. Marcus had sidestepped the clumsy attack. Brett might have been big, but he clearly had no training with blades, and his hand had closed around a heavy torque wrench on the workbench. The wrench had come around in a tight arc, connecting with Brett's wrist with enough force to send the knife clattering across the concrete floor. Brett had howled in pain, cradling his wrist, and Marcus had brought the wrench back around, this time catching the side of Brett's head. Brett had dropped like a sack of cement, blood immediately pooling from a gash above his ear. The sight of Brett falling had galvanized the others into action. They'd rushed the shop entrance as a group, 5 young men driven by panic and misguided loyalty. Marcus had grabbed a pry bar from the wall. the familiar weight of a weapon in his hands triggering muscle memory from 1,000 training sessions and a dozen real firefights. What happened next would later be described by prosecutors as a systematic assault of unprecedented brutality. But in that moment, Marcus wasn't thinking about courts or consequences. He was thinking about the flag these boys had tried to desecrate, about the disrespect they'd shown to everything he'd fought for, about the entitled arrogance that made them think they could do whatever they wanted without facing any real consequences. The pry bar had risen and fallen with mechanical precision. Chase Henderson had taken a blow to the shoulder that shattered his clavicle. Kyle Patterson had raised his arms to defend himself, resulting in multiple fractures in both forearms. A kid named Justin Miller, who'd been recording the whole thing on his phone, had dropped the device when the pry bar connected with his knee, tearing ligaments and shattering his patella. Sirens had begun wailing in the distance, growing closer. Mrs. Chen was still screaming from across the street, and Marcus had kept swinging, something primal and terrible unleashed inside him, years of controlled fury finally finding an outlet. Two more of the attackers, brothers named Ryan and Sean Foster, had tried to grab Marcus from behind. He'd spun, the pry bar catching Ryan across the jaw and sending teeth flying. Sean had managed to grab the bar, and for a moment they'd struggled over it, their faces inches apart. Marcus could see the fear in the younger man's eyes, could see the exact moment Sean realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Marcus had headbutted Sean with enough force to break his nose, then brought a knee up into his groin. As Sean crumpled, Marcus had turned his attention to the last attacker still standing, a kid named Alex Torres, who'd been hanging back, clearly wanting no part of this fight, but trapped by circumstances and peer pressure. "Run," Marcus had said, his voice flat and mechanical. "Run now, or you're next." Alex had run, stumbling over Diego Morales, who was still clutching his ribs on the ground outside. The sirens were close now, probably less than a minute away. Marcus had looked around at the carnage in his shop. 7 young men down, groaning or unconscious, blood on his concrete floor, his tools scattered everywhere. He'd dropped the pry bar and walked to his workbench, sitting down heavily on his stool. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline starting to fade and reality creeping back in. What had he done? These were kids, stupid entitled kids, but kids nonetheless. And he'd hurt them, badly. The first police car had arrived 30 seconds later, Deputy Rodriguez jumping out with his weapon drawn. "Marcus, hands where I can see them! Do it now!" Marcus had raised his hands, blood on his knuckles, his shirt torn, his face a mask of exhausted resignation. "They came at me, Rodriguez. They had a knife. They were going to kill me." More police cars had arrived, then ambulances. The scene had descended into controlled chaos as EMTs rushed to treat the injured. Brett Collins was unconscious and unresponsive. Diego Morales had multiple fractured ribs. Chase Henderson was in shock from his shattered clavicle. All of them would survive, but several would carry permanent injuries. Marcus had been handcuffed and placed in the back of a police cruiser, where he'd sat watching his shop become a crime scene. He'd seen the American flag still flying above it all, snapping in the hot wind, and felt a complex mixture of shame and defiance. He'd protected his property, defended himself against an armed attack. Wasn't that his right? But as more details emerged over the following hours, the narrative became more complicated. Yes, the young men had been trespassing. Yes, they'd been harassing Marcus for weeks. Yes, Brett Collins had pulled a knife. But security footage from Mrs. Chen's house showed that once Marcus had disarmed Brett and knocked him down, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Everything that came after, the systematic beating of 7 young men, most of whom were trying to flee by the end, that couldn't be justified as self-defense. The knife had been found on the floor of Marcus's shop, Brett's fingerprints all over it. But it had landed 15 feet from where Marcus had continued his assault on the others. Defense attorneys would later argue that Marcus had been defending his property and himself against a mob attack. Prosecutors would counter that Marcus Riley, a trained combat veteran, had gone far beyond what was necessary to neutralize the threat, and had instead engaged in an act of premeditated violence against a group of young men whose biggest crime was disrespect and vandalism. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in the middle of those two narratives. Marcus had been taken to the Valverde County Sheriff's Office, where he'd been processed and booked on multiple counts of aggravated assault. His bail had been set at $500,000, an amount that should have kept him locked up pending trial. But the veterans of Foreign Wars Post in Del Rio had rallied around him, seeing in Marcus's case a larger story about disrespect for veterans and the military, about the erosion of property rights, about a good man pushed too far by entitled youth. They'd raised his bail in 48 hours. The news media had descended on Del Rio like locusts. Cable news picked up the story. Veteran attacks, group of young men over flag dispute. Or the headlines varied depending on the outlet's political leanings. Conservative media portrayed Marcus as a hero defending his property and American values. Liberal media portrayed him as a dangerous vigilante whose PTSD had turned him into a violent threat. The actual facts of the case got lost in the partisan warfare. Marcus had returned home to find his life fundamentally altered. His shop had been shut down, pending investigation. Half the town treated him like a hero. The other half crossed the street when they saw him coming. His phone had rung constantly with interview requests, death threats, and messages of support in roughly equal measure. Tommy Cervantes had stuck by him, visiting him at home and helping him prepare for what everyone knew would be a long legal battle. "Boss, I saw how they treated you," Tommy had said during one of those visits. "They were punks. They deserved what they got." But Marcus wasn't so sure anymore. In the cold light of day, removed from the heat and adrenaline of that Saturday afternoon, he could see his actions differently. Yes, he'd been defending himself. Yes, they'd attacked him. But 7 young men in the hospital, 2 with life-altering injuries, was that really justice, or was it just violence begetting more violence? His therapist at the VA, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had managed to get him in for an emergency session. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who'd worked with combat veterans for 15 years and had seen every shade of PTSD imaginable. "Marcus, I need you to be honest with me," she'd said, sitting across from him in her small office. "When you were hitting those young men, what were you thinking?" Marcus had taken a long time to answer. "I wasn't thinking, or maybe I was thinking too much. I was back there, you know, in Kandahar. When we got ambushed and Tommy, not my Tommy, the other Tommy, Tommy Reeves, when he got killed because we weren't aggressive enough, weren't fast enough to put down the threat." Dr. Martinez had nodded slowly. "So in that moment, those boys weren't just disrespectful young men, they were enemy combatants." "I know how that sounds," Marcus had said quietly. "I know what it means. But yeah, that's what they became in my head. That's the PTSD talking, Marcus. That's the trauma response. You understand that, right? Your brain perceived a threat and reverted to combat protocols. It's not an excuse, but it is an explanation." The trial had been scheduled for 6 months later, which gave both sides time to prepare their cases and for the media circus to reach fever pitch. In that time, 2 important things happened. First, 3 of the young men who'd been injured, Diego Morales, Kyle Patterson, and Justin Miller, came forward with a different version of events. In sworn statements to the district attorney's office, they admitted that they'd been deliberately harassing Marcus for weeks, that Chase Henderson had been obsessed with provoking the veteran, and that they'd gone to his shop that Saturday specifically intending to start a fight. They also confirmed that Brett Collins had pulled the knife and threatened to kill Marcus. "We were stupid," Diego had said in his statement, his voice tight with shame and pain from his healing ribs. "We thought it would be funny to mess with some old veteran. We didn't think someone could actually get hurt. But Chase kept pushing it, and Brett, he always took things too far. When Mr. Riley defended himself, yeah, he went hard. But we came at him as a group. What was he supposed to do?" Second, surveillance footage from a traffic camera a block away had captured audio of the confrontation. On that audio, you could clearly hear Marcus warning the young men multiple times to leave, could hear Brett Collins threatening to kill him, could hear the chaos and panic in the voices of young men who'd suddenly realized they were in over their heads. The footage changed the narrative. It didn't excuse what Marcus had done, but it provided context that had been missing from the initial reports. These weren't innocent victims attacked by a crazed veteran. These were aggressors who'd gotten more than they bargained for when they targeted the wrong man. The district attorney, a pragmatic woman named Jennifer Hawkins, had reviewed all the evidence and made a calculated decision. She'd offered Marcus a plea deal: plead guilty to 3 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, serve 18 months in county jail, followed by 5 years of supervised probation and mandatory continued treatment for PTSD. It was a generous offer, given the severity of the injuries. Marcus's attorney, a former JAG officer named Robert Chen, had advised him to take it. "Marcus, I can probably get you acquitted on self-defense grounds, but if we go to trial and lose, you're looking at 20 years minimum. The DA's giving you a chance to move on with your life. I think you should take it." Marcus had sat in Robert's office, looking out the window at the Del Rio courthouse across the street. The American flag flew there too, and he'd watched it rippling in the breeze for a long time before speaking. "Those boys, they're going to be okay. Long term." Robert had consulted his notes. "Brett Collins has permanent brain damage from the head trauma. He'll need assisted care for the rest of his life. Chase Henderson regained full mobility in his shoulder after surgery. The others, broken bones heal, Marcus. They'll be okay physically, emotionally, psychologically. That's going to take time." Brett Collins, permanent brain damage. Marcus felt that weight settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. He'd ended that young man's life as surely as if he'd killed him. Brett would never finish college, never have a career, never get married or have kids, all because he'd pulled a knife in a moment of stupid bravado, and Marcus had responded with overwhelming force. "I'll take the deal," Marcus had said finally, "but I want to do something first." What he did was write letters. 7 letters, one to each of the young men he'd hurt. The letters weren't identical, but they all contained the same core message. An apology for the permanent damage he'd caused, an acknowledgement that he'd let his trauma control his actions, and a plea for them to learn from this tragedy. To Brett Collins's parents, he wrote, "There are no words adequate to express my sorrow for what I've done to your son. I let old ghosts control my actions, and your family will pay the price for the rest of Brett's life. I cannot undo what I've done. I can only promise that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be better than I was in that moment. I'm sorry. I'm so terribly sorry." Not all of the young men or their families accepted his apologies. Chase Henderson's father, a real estate developer named Richard Henderson, had been vocal in the media about wanting Marcus to serve the maximum sentence possible. "This man is a menace to society. PTSD is not an excuse for attempted murder. If my son and his friends had done to Marcus Riley what he did to them, they'd be facing life in prison. Justice needs to be colorblind, and it needs to be uniform." But Diego Morales had written back. His letter was short. "Mr. Riley, I accept your apology. We were wrong to harass you. You were wrong to hurt us so badly. Maybe we all need to learn to be better. I hope your time in jail helps you heal. I hope you can forgive yourself someday. I'm trying to forgive you." That letter had made Marcus cry for the first time since the incident. The day Marcus had pled guilty, the courtroom had been packed. Veterans groups had shown up in force, wearing their VFW and American Legion caps, standing in silent support of one of their own. The parents of the injured young men had been there too, their faces showing a complex mixture of anger, grief, and in some cases, reluctant understanding. Judge Patricia Morrison had been a stern woman in her 60s, with 30 years on the bench and a reputation for fairness tempered with compassion. She'd heard the prosecution's sentencing recommendation, listened to victim impact statements from the families, and then heard from character witnesses for Marcus. Tommy Cervantes had testified about Marcus's kindness as an employer, about how he'd given Tommy a chance when other shops wouldn't hire someone with a juvenile record. Mrs. Chen had testified about how Marcus had helped her with repairs around her house, never accepting payment, always looking out for the elderly widow across the street. 3 of Marcus's former squad mates from Afghanistan had testified via video link, describing the courage and selflessness he'd shown in combat. Then Brett Collins's mother had taken the stand. Sharon Collins was a small woman, her face drawn with the stress of months of caring for her brain-damaged son. She'd looked directly at Marcus as she spoke. "My son will never be the same. He needs help eating, using the bathroom, getting dressed. The doctors say he might regain some function, but he'll never be independent, never have the life we dreamed for him." Her voice had cracked, and she'd paused to compose herself. "But I've listened to all the evidence in this case. I've heard the recordings of my son and his friends harassing Mr. Riley. I've seen the video of Brett pulling that knife. And I have to ask myself, what did we teach our children about respecting others, about respecting veterans, about respecting property, about respecting boundaries? We raised Brett to believe he was special, that the rules didn't apply to him, that his privilege would protect him from consequences. We were wrong. Mr. Riley was wrong too. He should have stopped after disarming Brett, but my son should never have pulled that knife in the first place." The courtroom had been silent as Sharon Collins stepped down. Judge Morrison had taken a 10-minute recess, and when she returned, her face was grave. "Mr. Riley, please stand," she'd said. Marcus had stood, his hands clasped behind his back in an automatic military posture. "I've presided over thousands of cases in my career, but few have affected me as deeply as this one. What happened that Saturday afternoon was a tragedy born of multiple failures, failures of judgment, failures of character, failures of compassion on all sides. You, Mr. Riley, are a decorated combat veteran who served your country with honor and distinction. You came home carrying wounds that may never fully heal, wounds that our society has been inadequate in treating. But PTSD is not a license to commit violence. When you continued to assault those young men after the immediate threat was neutralized, you crossed a line from self-defense into criminal assault. You know this. Your guilty plea acknowledges this. However, I have also considered the extensive provocation you endured, the credible threat to your life when Mr. Collins drew that knife, and the genuine remorse you've shown in the months since this incident. I've read your letters to the victims. I've heard testimony about your character and your contributions to this community. I've reviewed your mental health records and treatment history. Therefore, I am accepting the prosecution's recommended sentence with one modification. You will serve 18 months in county jail with credit for time served. Upon your release, you will be on 5 years supervised probation, during which time you will continue intensive treatment for PTSD through the VA system. You will also perform 500 hours of community service, working with at-risk youth to teach them about the consequences of violence and the importance of respect. Finally, you will establish a victims' compensation fund, contributing 20% of your income for the duration of your probation to help offset the medical expenses of the young men you injured. Mr. Riley, I hope you will use your time in jail to reflect on your actions and to continue the healing process. I hope you will emerge from this experience as a voice for peace and reconciliation, teaching others the lessons you've learned so painfully. Do you have anything to say before I impose this sentence? Marcus had cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. Your Honor, I just want to say again how sorry I am, to Brett Collins and his family especially. I let my demons control me, and innocent people paid the price. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did. Thank you for giving me that chance. Judge Morrison had nodded. Then by the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I hereby sentence you to 18 months in the Val Verde County Jail, followed by 5 years supervised probation under the terms I've outlined. Court is adjourned. The gavel had fallen, and Marcus had been led away by bailiffs to begin serving his sentence. His time in county jail had been strange. Some inmates had treated him like a hero for standing up to entitled rich kids. Others had viewed him as just another violent offender who deserved to be there. Marcus had kept his head down, attended every therapy session available, and worked in the jail's maintenance shop repairing equipment. At night, lying on his bunk in the cell he shared with a 30-year-old drug offender named Carlos, Marcus had replayed that Saturday afternoon in his mind countless times. He'd asked himself the question that haunted him. At what point could he have made a different choice? When Brett pulled the knife, that was the moment of no return, wasn't it? Or was it earlier, when he'd grabbed Chase's wrist at the flagpole? Or even earlier, when he'd first noticed the group of young men hanging around across the street and hadn't reported them immediately to the police? Carlos, who was surprisingly thoughtful for a guy serving time for possession with intent to distribute, had offered his perspective one night. Man, I think you're asking the wrong question. It's not about when you could have made a different choice. It's about why you made the choices you did. You got that military training, right? That combat shit in your head. When those kids came at you, your brain went to war mode. That's not your fault. But learning to control that response, learning to choose peace when your instincts say violence, that's your responsibility now. Marcus had thought about that a lot. Carlos was right. The PTSD wasn't an excuse, but it was a factor he needed to understand and manage better. Dr. Martinez had been working with him on exactly that, recognizing the warning signs when his combat responses were being triggered, developing strategies to de-escalate his own arousal, practicing mindfulness and grounding techniques that could pull him back from the edge. He'd been released after serving 14 months, having earned time off for good behavior. Tommy Cervantes had been waiting for him at the jail entrance, along with a small group of veterans from the local VFW post. They'd taken him to breakfast at a diner in town, where the owner, a Vietnam veteran named Frank Russo, had refused to let Marcus pay. "You're one of us," Frank had said simply. "We take care of our own. You made a mistake. You paid for it. Now it's time to move forward." But moving forward proved harder than Marcus had hoped. His shop had been closed for so long that most of his customers had found other mechanics. The building's landlord had been sympathetic but firm. Marcus would need to pay all the back rent if he wanted to reopen. Between legal fees and the victim compensation fund, Marcus had no money to restart his business. He'd ended up taking a job at a national auto parts chain, working the counter for $12 an hour. It was a humbling come-down from owning his own business, but the manager, a former Army MP named Jessica Torres, had been willing to hire him despite his record. "You're overqualified for this job," she told him during the interview, "but I believe in second chances, and your references say you're honest and reliable. Just don't make me regret this." Marcus had thrown himself into the work, arriving early and staying late, helping customers with a level of expertise that exceeded his job description. He'd continued his therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez twice a week, attended his probation check-ins religiously, and started his community service hours at a local youth center. That's where he'd met Jamal Washington, a 16-year-old kid from the east side of Del Rio who was teetering on the edge of gang involvement. Jamal had been court-ordered to attend the youth center's after-school program, and he'd given Marcus nothing but attitude for the first few weeks. "Man, why should I listen to you?" Jamal had said during one of their mandatory mentoring sessions. "You're the dude who beat up all those kids. You're supposed to be teaching me about consequences. You are the consequences." The comment had stung, but Marcus had recognized the defense mechanism for what it was. "You're right," he'd said simply. "I am the consequences. I'm what happens when you let anger control you, when you let your past trauma dictate your present actions. I'm what happens when you think violence solves problems instead of creating new ones. So yeah, maybe I'm exactly the right person to teach you about consequences, because I'm living them every single day." Jamal had blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "So what? I'm supposed to feel sorry for you?" "No," Marcus had replied. "You're supposed to learn from my mistakes so you don't make them yourself. You think you're tough? You think fighting proves something? I was tougher than you'll ever be, kid. I was a combat engineer in Afghanistan. I defused IEDs that could have vaporized me. I ran toward gunfire while other people ran away. And you know what all that toughness got me? It got me 14 months in jail and permanent guilt over hurting people who didn't deserve it." "They disrespected you, though," Jamal had protested. "They were messing with your flag. That's disrespect, man." "Yeah, they disrespected me. And I could have called the cops, or moved my shop, or put up security cameras, or done 100 other things that didn't involve putting 7 people in the hospital. Instead, I let my pride and my PTSD make my decisions for me. Is that what you want? To let your worst impulses run your life?" Over the following months, something had shifted in Jamal. He'd started actually listening during their sessions, asking Marcus about his time in Afghanistan, about how he managed his PTSD, about what it felt like to carry guilt for your actions. Marcus had been honest in a way he hadn't been with many people, sharing the nightmares that still woke him up, the flashbacks that could be triggered by loud noises or sudden movements, the constant work it took to stay balanced and functional. "It's like being an alcoholic, I guess," Marcus had explained. "Except instead of alcohol, my addiction is to my combat training. Every day I have to choose not to let that training control my responses to normal civilian situations. Some days are easier than others. But I'm learning." Jamal had eventually opened up about his own situation. Absent father, overworked mother, older brother doing time for armed robbery, constant pressure from gang members in his neighborhood. "They say joining up is protection," Jamal had said. "But I see what happened to my brother. I see what happened to you. Maybe protection isn't worth what it costs." "Smart kid," Marcus had replied. "Took me 52 years to learn that lesson. You're ahead of the curve." The therapy, the community service, the humbling job at the auto parts store, all of it was slowly reshaping Marcus into someone different from the man who'd snapped that hot Saturday afternoon. He still flew his American flag every day, but now he flew it at his small rental house instead of a business. And when teenagers sometimes cut through his yard or made noise in the street, Marcus found himself choosing to let it go, recognizing that not every slight required a response. Brett Collins remained in assisted living, his condition unchanged. Marcus sent money to the Victim Compensation Fund every month, watching as 20% of his modest paycheck went to help pay for Brett's care. It was a tangible reminder of the cost of his actions, and Marcus treated it almost like penance. On the one-year anniversary of the incident, Marcus had driven out to the address he'd gotten from Brett's lawyer. It was a care facility on the outskirts of town, a clean but institutional building where the permanently disabled were housed and treated. He'd sat in his truck in the parking lot for 30 minutes, gathering his courage before finally walking inside. Sharon Collins had been in Brett's room, reading to her son from a book about Texas history. Brett sat in a wheelchair, his eyes tracking the movement in the room, but showing no real recognition or comprehension. When Sharon saw Marcus in the doorway, her expression had cycled through surprise, anger, and finally, a weary resignation. "Mr. Riley," she'd said quietly, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Mrs. Collins," Marcus had replied, his voice thick with emotion, "I know I have no right to be here. I needed to see Brett, to face what I did. If you want me to leave, I will." Sharon had looked at her son for a long moment, then back at Marcus. "Come in," she'd said finally. "Sit down." Marcus had entered the room, sitting in the chair on the opposite side of Brett's wheelchair from Sharon. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. Brett's face had a vacant quality, his mouth slightly open, a bit of drool on his chin that Sharon wiped away with practiced efficiency. "This is what every day looks like now," Sharon had said, her voice matter-of-fact but tinged with infinite sadness. "I read to him, talk to him, hope that somewhere in there he understands. The doctors say there's brain activity, that he might have some awareness, but he can't communicate, can't tell us what he needs or feels. We don't know if he's in pain or scared or just empty." Marcus had felt tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered. "I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I live with what I did every single day. I see Brett's face when I close my eyes. I hear him falling in my nightmares. I would give anything to undo that moment. But you can't," Sharon had replied. "None of us can. Brett made terrible choices that day. You made terrible choices. And now my son sits in this wheelchair while you get to walk free, rebuild your life, move forward. How is that fair?" "It's not fair," Marcus had agreed. "There's nothing fair about any of this. I paid legally for what I did, but the real payment, that's going to last the rest of my life, just like your payment will. We're both prisoners of that day, Mrs. Collins, just in different ways." They'd sat in silence for a while, the only sound Brett's occasional shuffling in his wheelchair and the distant beeping of medical equipment in other rooms. Finally, Sharon had spoken again. "Brett's father and I are divorcing," she said abruptly. "He couldn't handle this, couldn't handle seeing his son like this day after day. He visits once a month now, stays for an hour, and leaves looking relieved. I'm here every day because someone has to be, because he's my son, and no matter what he did or what happened to him, he deserves to have someone who loves him nearby." "You're a stronger person than I could ever be," Marcus had said. "I'm not strong," Sharon had replied. "I'm just a mother who doesn't have any other choice." Marcus had visited Brett 3 more times over the following year, always checking first with Sharon to make sure she was okay with it. The visits were never easy, but they felt necessary, a way of holding himself accountable beyond the legal requirements, a way of honoring the human cost of his actions. His relationship with Jamal had evolved from court-mandated mentoring into something like genuine friendship. Jamal had graduated high school, the first person in his family to do so, and had enrolled in the local community college to study automotive technology. "Because you taught me that working with your hands is honorable," Jamal had told Marcus, "and because I figure if I'm going to have a mentor who knows everything about cars, I should learn the same trade." Marcus had helped Jamal get a part-time job at the auto parts store, and Jessica Torres had been impressed enough with the kid's work ethic to start training him for management. "You're a good influence on these kids," Jessica had told Marcus. "Maybe your past mistakes are becoming someone else's future success." The thought had given Marcus some measure of peace. He couldn't undo what he'd done to Brett Collins and the others. He couldn't give back those 18 months he'd spent in jail, or erase the stigma of being a convicted felon, or rebuild his business, or reclaim his reputation in the community. But he could maybe, possibly, if he worked hard enough and stayed committed enough, turn his tragedy into something that prevented other tragedies. He'd started speaking at schools and youth centers about the dangers of violence, about the hidden costs of PTSD, about the importance of seeking help before you hurt someone. The presentations were always difficult, requiring him to relive that Saturday afternoon in detail, but the response from students and faculty had been positive. He was raw and honest in a way that reached kids who'd been through too many slick, corporate-sponsored assembly programs about making good choices. "Mr. Riley didn't come here to tell you violence is never the answer," Jamal had said during one of these presentations, where he joined Marcus on stage. "He came here to tell you that violence has consequences that follow you forever. That being tough doesn't mean being violent. That asking for help is harder than throwing a punch, but it's also smarter and braver." The words had resonated. Marcus had started getting invited to speak at other schools around the region, then to veterans groups as a cautionary tale about untreated PTSD, then to law enforcement training sessions about de-escalation and mental health awareness. His story, uncomfortable and tragic as it was, had become a teaching tool. His probation officer, a tough but fair woman named Rita Gonzalez, had noted the transformation during one of their monthly check-ins. "Marcus, when you first came to me 2 years ago, I figured you'd be back in jail within 6 months. Most violent offenders reoffend, but you've done the work. You've genuinely changed. How does it feel?" Marcus had thought about the question carefully before answering. "Honestly, it feels like I'm finally becoming the person I should have been when I got back from Afghanistan. The army trained me to be a warrior, but nobody trained me to stop being one when I came home. I'm learning that now. Better late than never, I guess." The 5 years of probation had passed more quickly than Marcus expected. He'd completed his community service hours, paid religiously into the Victim Compensation Fund, maintained his therapy schedule, and stayed out of trouble. On the day his probation officially ended, Rita had shaken his hand with genuine warmth. "You're free and clear, Marcus. No more check-ins, no more restrictions. You did it." But Marcus had continued his therapy sessions anyway, continued his speaking engagements, continued visiting Brett Collins once a month, because the end of his legal obligations didn't mean the end of his moral ones. On the 5th anniversary of the incident, the Del Rio newspaper had run a feature story about what had happened to everyone involved. Chase Henderson had graduated from college and was working in his father's real estate business, though the article noted he'd become an advocate for conflict resolution programs and had spoken at several schools about the incident. Diego Morales was in medical school, inspired by the doctors who'd treated his injuries to pursue a career in emergency medicine. Kyle Patterson was working as a physical therapist, using his own recovery from multiple fractures to help others heal. Justin Miller had become a documentary filmmaker, using his experience to create a short film about youth violence and its consequences. Of the others, Ryan and Sean Foster had both struggled with substance abuse issues in the aftermath, but were reportedly in recovery. Alex Torres, who'd run before things got really bad, had joined the Air Force and was serving overseas. Trevor Walsh had moved out of state and declined to be interviewed, and Brett Collins remained in assisted living, his condition unchanged, his mother still visiting every day. The article had included an interview with Marcus, conducted in the break room of the auto parts store where he still worked. The reporter, a young woman named Amanda Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen across from his old shop, had asked him if he ever regretted pleading guilty. "No," Marcus had answered without hesitation. "I was guilty. I crossed a line that day. Taking responsibility for that was the first step toward becoming someone better. Do I wish things had gone differently? Every single day. Do I wish I'd made better choices? Absolutely. But I can't change the past. I can only try to build a future where my mistakes prevent other people from making similar ones." "Some people still see you as a hero," Amanda had noted. "A veteran defending his property against entitled attackers. How do you respond to that?" Marcus had been quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not a hero. Heroes make the hard choice to walk away, to de-escalate, to choose peace, even when violence feels justified. I failed that test. Those young men harassed me, disrespected me, even threatened me, and I responded with overwhelming violence that permanently damaged one person and injured 6 others. That's not heroic, that's tragic." "But they attacked you first," Amanda had pressed. "They did," Marcus had agreed, "and I had every right to defend myself, but there's defending yourself, and then there's what I did. I let my combat training and my PTSD turn a tense situation into a bloodbath. That's on me, nobody else." The article had generated controversy, with some readers praising Marcus's accountability and others insisting he was being too hard on himself. But Marcus had stopped reading the comments section long ago. He'd learned that he couldn't control other people's perceptions of his story. He could only control his own actions and growth. Jamal had graduated from community college and was now working full-time as an assistant manager at a larger auto parts chain in San Antonio. He'd stayed in touch with Marcus, calling every week to check in and share updates about his life. "You know, Mr. Riley," Jamal had said during one of those calls, "my little brother's starting to hang with the wrong crowd." "Same situation I was in. You think you could talk to him?" Marcus had met with Jamal's brother, a 14-year-old named DeAndre, who had the same defensive swagger Jamal once wore like armor. Over burgers at a local diner, Marcus had shared his story again, watching the kid's eyes widen as he described the aftermath, the jail time, the guilt, the permanent damage to Brett Collins. "But you were defending yourself," DeAndre had protested. "That's different from gang stuff." "Is it?" Marcus had asked. "Both come from the same place, thinking violence solves problems, thinking respect is something you take by force instead of something you earn. I thought those kids disrespected me, so I hurt them. Gang members think rival gangs disrespect them, so they hurt each other. The trigger might be different, but the mentality is the same. And the consequences, those are always worse than you think they'll be." DeAndre had listened, really listened, in a way that reminded Marcus why he kept doing this work despite how painful it was. If he could reach even one kid, if he could prevent one act of violence, then maybe Brett Collins's tragedy wouldn't be entirely meaningless. Tommy Cervantes had eventually left Del Rio, moving to Houston to work at a high-end restoration shop that specialized in classic cars, but he'd called Marcus on the anniversary of the incident every year. "Boss, I just want you to know, you gave me a chance when nobody else would. You taught me that work had dignity. I wouldn't be where I am without you. Yeah, what happened was bad, but you're not defined by your worst day. You're defined by what you did after." Those words had meant more to Marcus than Tommy probably knew. Mrs. Chen had passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 years after the incident. Marcus had been one of the pallbearers at her funeral, and her daughter had thanked him for being such a good neighbor to her mother. "Mom always said you were one of the good ones," she'd told Marcus. She felt terrible about what happened, like somehow recording it made things worse. I told her she did the right thing. That video helped everyone understand what really happened. Marcus had visited Mrs. Chen's grave regularly after that, leaving flowers and telling her about his progress, about the kids he was helping, about the slow work of redemption. His old shop sat empty for 2 years before being converted into a coffee roastery. Sometimes Marcus would drive past it, looking at the building where his old life had ended and this strange new life had begun. The flagpole was still there, though no flag flew from it now. The new owners had painted over the bullet holes in the concrete, because yes, there had been bullet holes, though the media had never reported that part. Brett Collins's knife hadn't been the only weapon that day, just the only one that got photographed and entered into evidence. That was a detail Marcus carried quietly, another layer of complexity to an already complicated story. One of the other attackers, never identified, had fired a handgun during the chaos. The shot had missed everyone, burying itself in the concrete wall of the shop. In all the confusion, and with no security cameras inside the shop, it had been impossible to determine who'd fired or when. The weapon was never found, and the young men had all denied bringing a gun to the confrontation. Marcus suspected it had been Chase Henderson, based on the way Chase had reacted when questioned about it. But without proof, the matter had been dropped. It was one of those messy realities that complicated the neat narrative of veteran attacks, unarmed youth that some media outlets had run with. But Marcus never brought it up, never used it to justify his actions, because at the end of the day, he'd still nearly beaten a man to death and seriously injured 6 others. The presence of a gun in the chaos didn't change that fundamental truth. Dr. Martinez had retired after 30 years with the VA, but she'd continued seeing Marcus as a private patient, refusing to pass him to another therapist. "You're one of my success stories, Marcus," she'd told him during one session, "not because you avoided consequences for your actions, but because you accepted them and grew from them. That's rare. Most people get stuck in denial or self-justification. You chose accountability. That takes real courage." "Dying doesn't feel like courage," Marcus had replied. "Feels like the bare minimum." "That's because you've internalized the lessons," Dr. Martinez had explained. "You're not performing accountability for others anymore. You're living it because it's who you've become. That's growth." By year 7 post-incident, Marcus had saved enough money to make a down payment on a small house. It wasn't fancy, just a modest 3-bedroom ranch on the south side of Del Rio, but it was his. He'd converted the garage into a small workshop where he could work on cars in his spare time, taking on projects for friends and acquaintances. Word had spread about his skills and his fair prices, and soon he had a steady stream of weekend work. He'd also started fostering dogs from the local animal shelter, finding that caring for abused and abandoned animals helped him process his own trauma in unexpected ways. The dogs didn't care about his past. They only cared that he was patient, consistent, and kind. He'd adopted 2 permanently, a pit bull mix named Sergeant and a German shepherd named Liberty, who became his constant companions. "You know what's funny?" Marcus had said to Jamal during one of his visits back to Del Rio. "I spent so much of my life trying to be tough, trying to prove I was strong enough to handle anything. Now I'm in my late 50s, living in a small house, working a blue-collar job, fostering rescue dogs, and I feel more at peace than I ever did when I owned my own business and had that reputation as a hard-ass veteran. Turns out strength isn't about how much damage you can do. It's about how much healing you can facilitate." Jamal had smiled at that. "That's deep, Mr. Riley. You should write that down." Marcus had started keeping a journal on Dr. Martinez's recommendation, documenting his thoughts and feelings as he navigated this new life. The entries were raw and honest, filled with continued remorse for what he'd done, but also hope for what he was becoming. He'd shared some entries during his speaking engagements, letting students and veterans see the ongoing nature of his struggle. One entry from Year 8 read, "Went to see Brett today. Sharon wasn't there. Her sister Mary was sitting with him instead. Mary told me Sharon had the flu and needed to rest. I sat with Brett for an hour, told him about my week, about the dogs, about a kid I'm mentoring who reminds me of him in some ways, smart, athletic, full of potential. I don't know if Brett can hear me or understand, but I keep talking anyway, because maybe somewhere in there he knows someone's acknowledging what happened to him, what I did to him. I told him I was sorry again. I'll never stop being sorry." The Del Rio community had slowly come to accept Marcus back into its fabric, though there remained pockets of resistance. Richard Henderson still crossed the street when he saw Marcus coming. Some businesses had no soliciting signs that seemed specifically aimed at keeping Marcus out, but others, particularly veteran-owned establishments, welcomed him warmly. Frank Russo at the diner still refused to let him pay for meals. The local VFW post had made him a member and frequently asked him to speak at their meetings. He'd reconnected with some of his old army buddies, guys he'd served with, who'd lost touch after he'd gotten arrested. Most had been supportive, understanding that PTSD could make anyone snap under the right circumstances. A few had distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the violence or worried about their own reputations. Marcus accepted both reactions with equanimity. He couldn't control how others viewed him. Year 9 brought an unexpected development. Chase Henderson had reached out through Facebook, asking if they could meet. Marcus had been skeptical. Richard Henderson's hostility was well known, but something in Chase's message suggested genuine intent. They'd agreed to meet at a neutral location, a park near the center of town. Chase was 31 now, no longer the arrogant 22-year-old who'd taunted Marcus about the flag. He walked with a slight limp from his shoulder injury. The surgery had saved his mobility, but not his athletic career. He'd been a competitive swimmer before the incident. That was over now. They'd sat on a bench overlooking the small duck pond, both men uncomfortable with the weight of their shared history. Chase had spoken first. "Mr. Riley, I've been wanting to do this for years, but I needed to work up the courage. I need to apologize to you." Marcus had been stunned. "You need to apologize to me? Chase, I put you in the hospital. I permanently damaged your shoulder. I nearly killed your friend. What could you possibly need to apologize for?" "For starting all of it," Chase had said, his voice thick with emotion. "My friends and we spent weeks harassing you because we thought it was funny. We were bored rich kids who'd never faced real consequences for anything. We targeted you specifically because you were a veteran, because we thought it would be funny to mess with some tough guy and see how long it took to make him snap. It was cruel and stupid, and I've spent 9 years living with the guilt of knowing that our actions led to Brett spending the rest of his life in a wheelchair." Marcus had sat in silence, processing this confession. "You were trying to make me snap?" "Yeah," Chase had admitted, shame coloring his voice. "It was like a game to us. How far could we push before you reacted? We didn't think anyone would actually get seriously hurt. We thought maybe there'd be a confrontation. Maybe the cops would get called. We'd get a slap on the wrist from our parents. We didn't think you'd—" He'd broken off, unable to finish. "Didn't think I'd hurt you that badly," Marcus had finished for him. "Neither did I, Chase. That's the thing about violence. Once it starts, it takes on a life of its own. My PTSD made it worse, but even without that, the situation was dangerous. Your friend pulled a knife on me. Someone fired a gun. It could have ended so much worse." "Brett pulled that knife because I kept pushing him too," Chase had said quietly. "I knew Brett had a temper. I knew he'd escalate if I egged him on. And I did it anyway because I wanted to see what would happen. And then when you fought back, when you were defending yourself, I panicked. We all panicked. And Brett paid the price for my stupid game. They'd sat together for another hour, two men bound by trauma and regret, trying to find some path toward mutual understanding. Chase had told Marcus about the therapy he'd been in, about the relationships that had fallen apart because he couldn't forgive himself, about the distance that had grown between him and his father because Richard refused to acknowledge that Chase bore any responsibility. "My dad thinks you're a monster," Chase had said. "He thinks you should have gotten 20 years, but I know better. You're just a man who got pushed past his breaking point by a bunch of idiots who didn't understand what they were playing with. We lit the fuse. You were the bomb. And Brett got caught in the explosion." "That's probably the most honest description of what happened that I've ever heard," Marcus had replied. "But it doesn't absolve me, Chase. I made choices that day. I could have chosen differently." "So could I," Chase had said. "So could all of us. That's what I've learned. We're all responsible for the consequences of our actions, even when we don't intend those consequences. I didn't intend for Brett to get hurt. You didn't intend to give him permanent brain damage. But intentions don't matter as much as outcomes." Before they'd parted, Chase had asked Marcus if he'd be willing to speak at a men's group Chase was part of, young professionals dealing with guilt and trauma from various sources. Marcus had agreed, and that speaking engagement had led to others. His story resonated with people who'd made mistakes and were trying to find redemption, people who carried guilt that threatened to consume them. The speaking engagements didn't pay much, but they weren't about money. They were about meaning. About taking his tragedy and using it to help others avoid similar paths, about being honest in a world that often rewarded deception and self-justification. Year 10 arrived, a full decade since that Saturday afternoon that had changed so many lives. Marcus was 62 now, his hair more grey than brown, his face more lined, his body showing the accumulated wear of a hard life. But there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a calm that came from doing the hard work of becoming better. He'd organized a remembrance ceremony at a local park, inviting everyone affected by the incident. He hadn't been sure anyone would come, but to his surprise, nearly 20 people showed up. Diego Morales came, now a third-year resident at a hospital in San Antonio. Kyle Patterson came with his wife and infant daughter. Justin Miller came with a camera, documenting the event for a follow-up to his earlier documentary. Chase Henderson came, bringing his girlfriend. Tommy Cervantes drove in from Houston. Jamal came with his brother DeAndre, both now doing well and staying out of trouble. Sharon Collins came, pushing Brett in his wheelchair. Brett was 42 now, his condition unchanged, his eyes still vacant, his mother still devoted to his daily care. Richard Henderson had not come, nor had several of the other parents, but their absence was understandable. Marcus had stood before the small gathered group and spoken from the heart. 10 years ago today, I committed acts of violence that I will regret for the rest of my life. I hurt people who didn't deserve the full force of my rage. I let my trauma control my actions, and others paid the price for my failure. I've spent this decade trying to become someone better, someone who chooses peace over violence, someone who channels his pain into helping others rather than hurting them. But I'm not here today to talk about my redemption. I'm here to remember Brett Collins, whose life was stolen by my actions. I'm here to apologize again to everyone I hurt, everyone whose lives were permanently altered because I couldn't control myself. And I'm here to make a promise. I will never stop working to prevent other people from making my mistakes. I will never stop speaking truth about the costs of violence. I will never stop trying to honor Brett's lost potential by helping other young people find theirs. Sharon had wheeled Brett forward after Marcus finished speaking. She'd looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps acceptance. "Mr. Riley has visited Brett every month for 10 years, she told the group. He's paid into Brett's care fund without fail. He's never made excuses or tried to diminish what he did. That doesn't give me my son back, but it matters. Accountability matters. Growth matters. If we can't learn from tragedies, what's the point of surviving them? Diego had spoken next, sharing how the incident had changed his life trajectory, pushing him toward medicine and teaching him about the fragility of the human body. Kyle had talked about forgiveness, about how holding on to anger had only hurt him until he'd finally let it go. Justin had shown a clip from his documentary, footage of interviews with all the survivors describing their paths forward. Chase had been the last to speak, his voice steady and clear. I spent years blaming Mr. Riley for what happened. It was easier than accepting my own role. But the truth is, we all made choices that day. Bad choices, stupid choices, choices that hurt people. The difference is what we did after. Mr. Riley chose accountability and growth. I tried to choose denial and blame, and it almost destroyed me. If there's anything to learn from this awful anniversary, it's that we're all capable of terrible things when we're pushed or provoked or traumatized. But we're also all capable of redemption if we're willing to do the work. The ceremony had ended with a moment of silence for Brett, and then people had mingled, sharing stories and updates, creating connection out of shared trauma. It wasn't healing exactly. Some wounds never fully heal, but it was progress. It was community built from brokenness. Marcus had found himself standing beside Sharon as the group began to disperse. "Thank you for coming," he'd said quietly. "I know how hard this must be." "It's hard every day," Sharon had replied, "but you were right about one thing. Accountability matters. You've held yourself accountable. That's more than most people do." "It's the least I could do," Marcus had said, "and it still feels insufficient." "It is insufficient," Sharon had agreed. "Nothing will ever be sufficient to give me back my son. But it's something. And in this world, sometimes something is all we get." They'd stood together in silence for a moment. Two people forever bound by tragedy, finding what small comfort they could in shared presence. Marcus's story had continued beyond that 10th anniversary, of course. Life didn't stop just because a significant milestone had passed. He'd kept working, kept speaking, kept mentoring, kept visiting Brett, kept trying to be better than he'd been the day before. His dogs had gotten older, and when Sargent had passed away at 14, Marcus had grieved deeply, but had also fostered 3 more dogs in his memory. Jamal had gotten married and had a baby girl he'd named Marcella. "After you, Mr. Riley, because you showed me what it means to be a real man." Marcus had cried when Jamal told him that, overwhelmed by the idea that anything good could come from his story. Tommy had opened his own restoration shop and had offered Marcus a partnership, but Marcus had declined. "That's your dream, not mine," he'd said. "I'm content where I am, but I'm proud of you, Tommy. So damn proud." Dr. Martinez had finally fully retired at 75, but she'd stayed in touch with Marcus, meeting him for coffee once a month to check in. "You're one of my greatest successes," she'd told him during one of those coffees. "Not because you avoided consequences, but because you transformed yourself through accepting them. That's rare, Marcus. Treasure it." The local newspaper had done a 15-year follow-up story, documenting where everyone was now. Brett was still in assisted care, his condition unchanged. Chase was married with 2 kids, working in non-profit management focused on youth violence prevention. Diego was a successful emergency room doctor, known for his compassionate bedside manner. Kyle was running a physical therapy clinic that offered free services to veterans. The others had all found their paths forward, carrying their scars, but not letting those scars define them. And Marcus was working part-time at the auto parts store, supplementing his income with speaking engagements and weekend mechanic work. He was living modestly but contentedly in his small house with his rescue dogs. He was mentoring at-risk youth and advocating for better PTSD treatment for veterans. He was visiting Brett Collins once a month and paying into the care fund without fail. He was choosing peace every single day, even when violence would be easier. The American flag still flew outside his house, raised at sunrise and lowered at sunset with the same precision he'd learned in basic training. But now, when teenagers occasionally cut through his yard, or when someone's music was too loud, or when life presented him with the small daily irritations that used to trigger his combat responses, Marcus had learned to breathe through them, to recognize them for what they were, minor inconveniences, not mortal threats, to choose de-escalation over confrontation. Some nights he still had nightmares. Some days the weight of what he'd done to Brett Collins felt unbearable. But he'd learned to carry that weight without letting it crush him, to acknowledge his guilt without drowning in it, to remember his worst day without letting it define all his days. One evening, sitting on his porch with Liberty at his feet and watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Marcus had reflected on the 16 years since the incident. He was 68 now, closer to the end than the beginning, and he'd spent more than a quarter of his remaining life trying to atone for one afternoon of uncontrolled violence. Was it worth it? The question haunted him sometimes. If he could go back, knowing what he knew now, would he make different choices? Of course. But he couldn't go back. None of them could. All they could do was move forward, carrying their scars and their lessons, trying to be better than they'd been. His phone had buzzed with a text from Chase. "Hey, Mr. Riley, my son asked me today what a hero is. I told him about you, not about the violence, but about the accountability, about choosing to be better every day even when it's hard. I hope that's okay." Marcus had stared at that text for a long time, tears blurring his vision. A hero. He was no hero. Heroes prevented tragedies. He'd caused one. But maybe, just maybe, if his story prevented even one person from making his mistakes, there was some redemption to be found in that. He'd typed back, "I'm honored, Chase, but I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who learned too late that strength isn't about how much damage you can do. It's about how much damage you can prevent. Thank you for understanding that. And thank you for being part of my path forward. All of you, everyone who's shown me grace I didn't deserve, you're the real heroes of this story." The sun had dipped below the horizon, and Marcus had stood to lower his flag for the evening. He'd folded it with practiced precision, holding the triangular bundle against his chest for a moment before carrying it inside. Tomorrow he'd raise it again, and the day after, and the day after that, a daily reminder of what he was fighting for and what he'd nearly destroyed in its name. The Texas Bloodbath, as the media had called it, was 16 years in the past, but its lessons about violence and accountability, about trauma and healing, about the cost of rage and the value of redemption, those lessons remained painfully relevant. Marcus Riley would carry them for the rest of his life, a burden he'd earned and a responsibility he'd finally learned to honor.